Welcome everybody to Finance Essentials with Danny Hudson. I am your host, Danny Hudson, and boy I'm fired up today. I am fired up. I might want to hit reset and start this one over when I calm down, but we're gonna dive right into it. So again, this is the Finance Essentials podcast with Danny Hudson. We just want to say I appreciate that you guys are tuning in this week. I had a lot of really good feedback from the show last week and the week before. The one we actually did 2 weeks ago regarding student loans has actually been doing pretty well online. It's our most viewed and most listened to. The first show to be right around that triple digit mark. So it definitely seems as though doing something with student loans was a good route to go. But got a lot of feedback last week. It seems like that you guys like the Christmas tree in the background. So maybe if you guys like it that much, maybe I'll actually keep it going into the new year to to get a little bit more positive feedback. One of the things that I also noticed too here is, if you're watching, right over here is a drawing that my 4-year-old did. He's been big into Power Rangers lately, and so he drew one of the Black Ranger. So I just noticed that that's in the background as well. But again, thank you guys for tuning in. I really appreciate the wonderful feedback that you guys provide every single week. I really enjoy doing these shows, but one of the things that really makes me feel good is knowing that there are people out there that are really getting a lot out of them. So again, thank you for being here. And again, to follow us on social media. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, we're on LinkedIn. I recently created a Parler account. It's not as user friendly as Twitter is. The interface on it's pretty wonky, and it seems like there's a lot less content creators there, which is actually probably good for me, because I feel like there's probably a pretty big gap between a place like Parler and a place like Twitter. So I'm tinkering around in there, and we'll see how it goes. It's definitely a different world than Twitter, but so far the reception has been pretty good, and so maybe there's some opportunity there as well. Like I mentioned on last week's show, the webinar is up on the website. So far, some of the feedback that I've gotten has been really positive and really good. So maybe the webinars is something that we'll do in the longer run, where we'll introduce some more. And so it's nice to know that people are taking advantage of that, and they're getting some good value out of it. So the reason why I'm fired up today is because, again, I don't think I've made it a secret known as far as my feelings on the lockdowns. Again, the way my brain works is from a finance perspective, right? So I think about a lot of things in terms of monetary value creation, things along those lines. And so with more states going into lockdown, some states staying out of lockdown, so far I haven't really seen a lot of evidence that really decides one way or the other. But I saw, maybe if I can find the video, I'll post it on the show notes page. But I saw a video of a lady in California who basically went through the effort of spending thousands of dollars of setting up an outdoor dining facility that was actually being shut down by the mayor of LA, where right across the street, literally less than 50 feet away from her outdoor dining area that was banned, there were massive tents that were set up where they were going to have an outdoor dining food event, something like that, for a movie studio. And so, I mean, it's pretty heartbreaking to watch. I mean, she's literally on the video, and and she talks about how she's going to lose everything, and she spent all this money for her outdoor dining a place that way people could eat, and it's only going to be shut down, whereas less than 50 feet away there's going to be hundreds of people eating and gathering in an outdoor setting that's basically the exact same as hers. So that was really hard to see, and the article that I'm actually using today as our starting point is from Hannah Cox, who she does some really good work. And the title of her article this week is called "How Big Government Stacked the Deck Against Small Business." I know we've on previous shows, and if you do follow us on social media, I do talk a lot about the impacts that a lot of these lockdowns have had on small businesses and how a lot of them are in pretty rough shape. But what Hannah does is she really does a great job breaking down what that looks like at this point in time, and really adds a lot of numbers and a lot of context to it. And so I'll go ahead and get started. So what she starts off by saying is most of us wouldn't list 2020 as our best year, but you know who would? Amazon, Walmart, Google, Apple, and a whole lot of other big corporations who have seen their sales and stocks soar versus prior year amidst the pandemic. And so she says, small businesses have been pummeled by excessive and insane government lockdowns of the economy. Experts warn that 1/3 of small businesses could ultimately shut down for good, and hundreds of thousands have already done just that. Now, if you've listened to prior shows, you know that we've talked about small businesses and businesses in general that have shuttered and they don't plan to reopen, and other industries too, such as movie theaters and things, they may never bounce back, either. So what she ends up doing, she talks about these big corporations and some of them that she mentions by name. So for example, Amazon sales were up 40% in Q2. Their stock was up 97%. Apple hits a $2 trillion market cap, which no other company has done before, and they reported about $60 billion in revenue. Facebook stock up 85%, Google up by 50%, Netflix up by 63%, Microsoft up by 57%. All of these massive corporations. Now, she doesn't go into some of the other ones like Walmart and Target and so on and so forth, but their stocks have also seen significant increases, not in the same scale, but also significant growth. Again, right, because there's no lockdown that's implemented for them. A lot of it is going to be your small businesses are the ones who are deemed not essential and therefore not allowed to operate. And so she says, small businesses are the lifeblood of America. They comprise the majority of U.S. companies and employ nearly 50% of all citizens. Now, that's surprisingly accurate. When I looked it up, it was like 49.8%. So, I mean, it's literally like dead on. Not only are they an essential part of our economy, though, but they also represent the American dream. And this has really been the big point that I've been hammering home for several shows and a lot, especially on social media. And what we try to do in Finance Essentials is really help people to understand and focus on their financial future and being able to achieve that financial freedom. But the idea that no matter who you are, you can come here, work hard, do the right thing, and build something for yourself and for your family. And this next part I'm going to emphasize, and I'm even going to read it twice for you guys, but there is no value more prized than that in our society. And small businesses are the tangible iteration of that ideal. Again, I'm going to read it one more time. There is no value more prized than that in our society, and small businesses are the tangible iteration of that ideal. So really what she's doing here is summing up one of the big points that we've been hammering home is that owning your financial future and owning your income is going to give you the ability to be able to achieve a level of freedom and the level of independence that allows you to achieve the dream and the goals that you have set for yourself and for your family. So then she goes on to talk about something that's very important, because I know a lot of people talk about stimulus, the need for stimulus. Why haven't we gotten another stimulus? We got $1,200 checks a little while back, so on and so forth. And so what she does is she actually breaks down the CARES Act, which, if you guys recall, was the first stimulus that was passed. It was about $2 trillion, 2.3, somewhere right around in that neighborhood. And so she actually breaks it down to that level. And it was $2 trillion went to big businesses, $58 billion went to airlines, $17 billion went to Boeing, and about $350 billion of that was earmarked for small businesses, of which $250 million of it actually ended up going to bigger corporations, right? So they were ones that were like, oh, let's put in an application here and see if we can get a little bit of that government money. And they did. They got approved. And then sure enough, not a lot of times, but several times, a little bit down the line, somebody caught them. And then they were like, oh, just like a lot of politicians where they're like, oh, I'm really so sorry. We shouldn't have done that. But but really they're just apologizing because they got caught, right? They don't really care that they did it. They did it consciously. They were just hoping that they weren't going to be the ones that got caught. But only about 5% of small businesses actually received PPP loans, right? So only about 5% actually received money in the CARES Act. And one of those things that I typically tend to go into when it comes to a lot of this, just handouts, and it's not that, I mean, I am opposed to just handouts, but what I'm more opposed to is how it's handled, right? Because if you guys remember, Andrew Yang, who was a Democratic nominee when he was running for president, he basically said that the government is good at one thing, and that's sending out checks, right? I mean, that's basically what he said that they're good at, is sending out checks, and they do it on a monthly basis, whether it's Social Security, whether it's disability, whether it's Medicare, Medicaid. They're basically good at paying out money. And I don't actually have this in my notes, but one of the things that you guys might also be interested to find out is that when this CARES Act passed, there were also European citizens that received checks for $1,200. In particular, I think it was Norway, and there were also a very large number of people who were actually deceased that received $1,200 checks. I actually saw, and I'll premise this by saying that. I haven't been able to vet this, so I don't know for certain, but Rand Paul actually tweeted the other day that he tried to pass some legislation that would at least stop stimulus checks from going to people who were deceased, and it got rejected because the opposition to it said that it would take at least 3 years for them to taper that down. So essentially, if you were a deceased person and you are listening to this show right now, you may have more checks on the way. If you received a $1,200 check back in, what was that, April or May, you may have more money on the way. So congratulations. You might not be paying taxes anymore, but you're still getting checks. So congratulations. Maybe you can spend it and boost the economy or something like that for a little while. But one of the things, like I said, is fraud, waste, things like that I typically tend to be really concerned about because there's no accountability. So why not have a little bit of fraud and waste in there? And so what I saw is that the New York Post reported there were approximately 2,500 or so suspicious reports in September, which was the most in 2014, which is basically people who received money, and there was a report that was submitted about them that they should not have received, that money. And then that made me think too, with the amount of suspicious activity, and then all of this money that actually ended up going into big businesses that was actually earmarked for small businesses. What does that look like? And so what I actually found was that according to the Small Business Administration and the Treasury Department, they do intend to audit this program, right? And so then you're thinking, all right, well, they'll audit it, they'll find out where the money went, and then maybe they can fix it. They can claw back some of it. But then what they say is that they basically said that they're only going to focus on loans, and I'm sure they might not. There might be some other exceptions that are thrown in there. But they claim that they're going to focus on loans that exceeded $2 million. So what that says to me is that if you decided that you wanted to commit fraud against the PPP program, or I guess program is part of it, but if you wanted to commit fraud against PPP, that if you did it for $1.9 million, you defrauded the federal government and the PPP for $1.9 million, you can probably stop wiping your forehead, and you can probably relax and sleep a little bit, because according to the Small Business Administration and the Treasury Department, it doesn't sound like you were going to get audited. So you might be off scot-free with $1.9 million. If any of you out there did that, reach out to me. By all means, I'll keep it anonymous. I won't rat you out, as my 4-year-old likes to say. Snitches get stitches. But I just think that it's very impressive that they're going to start the threshold at $2 million. especially considering that their reputation in general. And so this article really spoke a lot to me as a small business owner. I know a little while back I also did a podcast on some good news, which was the amount of people who are applying for employee identification numbers and starting their own businesses this year, which is continuing to go up, which is great to hear. Assuming that hopefully a lot of you guys can kind of get up and off the ground before you get shut down. But I'm hearing a lot of numbers that are in the millions as far as, number of businesses that might not be operable anymore. But what does that mean to the general landscape? And so I looked it up on the Chamber of Commerce, and I saw that according to 2018 statistics, that there were approximately 30 million small businesses in the U.S. And then about 22 million of those, which would be including me, is individually operated. And that in the U.S., approximately 99.9% of all businesses have less than 500 employees. So when people talk about these mega corporations and these massive companies and multinationals and so on and so forth, I mean, you're talking about 0.1% of the total number of businesses that operate in the United States. And then another statistic was about 20% fail in the first year. About 40% of businesses are profitable, about 30% of them break even, and then about 30% of them actually lose money on a yearly basis. So about 40% or so of small businesses are profitable, which is not a lot. One of the things that it doesn't really go into is the Chamber of Commerce data is ebbs and flows, right? So when they say 20% of businesses fail in the first year, how does that work as far as the timing of when they counted the total number of businesses? Is it done in December? And so in January to December, 20% of businesses fail in the first year? Or if you start yours in November, does that go until next November? And then if they count it in December, it doesn't really go into a lot of detail in terms of how some of that's tracked. Also too, as far as the total number of profitable, it doesn't really specify as far as what that profit margin is. One of the other things that I did find, according to the Huffington Post, which I'll talk about them in another minute or so, is that according to the Huffington Post, that about, what was the number? So according to the Huffington Post, most of those single businesses where it's just a single individual actually only have annual sales, and they only make about $45,000 a year. So the actual threshold as far as the small businesses, that not a lot of them are really game changers in terms of total revenue. And so what this does is it kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of what the small business landscape in the U.S. looks like. And so what I also wanted to do was talk about what the impact was. So one of the points that she actually mentioned in her article that really stood out to me was that 1/3 of small businesses could ultimately shut down for good. Now she says experts. I believe that she actually had it linked in there as far as 1/3 of small businesses, because one of the other things that actually stood out for me was a video, which I'll post in the show notes, was an article that was actually from the Wall Street Journal. It was a video about 5 minutes long where they actually looked at Yuma, Arizona. And what they mentioned in the video was that they expect up to 4 million businesses to ultimately close from COVID impacts. And so if we look at it from a standpoint of 4 million businesses out of 30 million businesses in 2018, you're looking at approximately, what is that, 1 in 7-ish businesses that are closing. But one of the things that's not actually counting is a lot of businesses like me, where it's just me. It's currently a side business. I'm actually currently, still employed elsewhere, so it doesn't break down what those 4 million are. But let's just say, as we know, based off of what's currently happening with COVID, that the hospitality industry is hit significantly. And so if something happens to my business where I have to close it for whatever reason, me losing my job and having to close my business is very different from somebody who has been deemed non-essential because they operate a restaurant, right? So if you operate a restaurant, but maybe you have 30 employees. So now you're not opening up anymore because as far as people are concerned, you're not essential. That's 30 people now that are no longer working. That's 30 people now who were paying their bills, they were paying taxes. There are certain aspects that those employees are impacted very much. So even though they talk about 4 million that might be closing, they don't necessarily specify. Now, again, based off of what we just said and what we've talked about in prior podcasts, is there's a very good and high expectancy rate that a lot of those are going to be based in hospitality. Because you're not going to really get that much of a bailout if you're a small business that employs 10 or 15 people and you have to shut down again for the next several months. It's going to be very difficult for you to to be able to claw back out of that. So again, you're talking about millions of businesses, approximately 1 in 7. My guess is that if you were to take out the people like me, and again, this is just an estimate, my guess is it's probably going to be closer to 1 in 4, maybe 1 in 5 in terms of businesses. Now, one of the things that we've also talked about in prior episodes is, well, what happens to all of those businesses that are closed Well, like we've reported in the past, other companies such as Domino's, such as Chipotle, other multinational, massive corporations, publicly traded companies that have the capital, what they're doing is they're basically leveraging their capital, they're leveraging their infrastructure, they're leveraging their resources, and they're buying up these lots, right? So this restaurant closes and they go, okay, well, we'll buy it because it's a whole lot cheaper than it was 2 years ago, and then we'll expand our footprint. So a lot of your large major publicly traded restaurant chains, your Dardens, your Domino's, your Chipotle's, organizations and groups like that have already gotten to the point where they're back at pre-COVID levels. So while a lot of your small business owners are actually struggling just to keep the lights on, these guys have already gotten to the point where they're operating at pre-COVID levels, which means that all of this talk about wanting to support local businesses and wanting to support small business owners, it's not happening. It's not happening. And a lot of it is because they just can't operate. I mean, we've talked about being able to diversify revenue streams and the difficulty that comes into play whenever you're talking about large brick and mortar restaurants where you have a lot of overhead costs. You might not be able to operate for months at 25% capacity, and takeout orders and curbside pickup and DoorDash, where DoorDash is essentially eating up all of your profit, or Uber Eats, or whatever it might be. Diversification is always important, but that's not necessarily going to be your major bread and butter when it comes to your revenues. Now, this isn't speaking for all businesses. If you guys do follow us on social media, one of the things that I did point out was I did have a conversation with a gentleman who owns a coffee shop, and he happens to be pretty well located near a large residential area. And because of all people like myself who have been working from home since COVID began, he's actually doing better. He's seen his sales go way up. People aren't going downtown anymore and just picking up Starbucks on the way. They're working from home. And so if they need a little bit of a break, they go around the corner to the local coffee shop. But now, again, that will tend to be a little bit few and far between. So the last point that I really wanted to talk about, and this one to me, it's very similar to when I did the show last week and I talked about the continental dollars back in the 1700s of when the United States switched over to the US dollar. This is the point that will really drive home the importance and the severity of the current situation and why it is ever increasingly more important for you to be able to own your financial future and to be able to own your source of income and be able to take control of your life. Is that out of curiosity, I wanted to see what the business impact was compared to the only other recent time of what we really have of business closures, right? So I went back and I looked up data from the Great Depression, right, which we all know was back in the 20s. Well, maybe we don't all know that, but right before World War II, we had the Great Depression, and so I was like, well, what did business closures look like during the Great Depression? Well, it was a different world, so the numbers didn't quite make sense to me. I think it said something like 1 million owned and operated farms closed. We don't really live in that world anymore, and so I didn't really know kind of what that meant. It sounded bad, and it's got the name Great Depression in it, so I'm almost certain that it wasn't good. But what we do have, though, is we do have business closures during the Great Recession, right? Which a lot of us lived through back in 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010-ish, right around in there, which is right around the time that I was coming out of college. So I looked it up, and so according to the Huffington Post, which we referenced to earlier, and again, I'll include these in the show notes so you guys can go back and look at them, but according to the Huffington Post, they actually closed, these businesses that closed for good was approximately 170,000 small businesses closed between 2008 and 2010. So what they don't, well, first off, that's a small, minuscule number compared to the maybe 4 million number that we're talking about now, right? I mean, that's what, less than 5% of what we're talking about from COVID. And so at first I was like, well, I need to understand this a little bit more. So obviously the numbers are eye-opening, right? Because as we've talked about in the past, the Fed's balance sheet, due to printing, which they've printed up approximately $6 trillion, which, well, I'll go back to that in a second. But, they've printed up all of this money, and we're still going to lose potentially 4 million businesses. But one of the things that Huffington Post doesn't really specify is how much of that is related to normal business cycle, and how much of that is directly related to, essentially it was a housing market crash, right? So people were over leveraged in subprime mortgages. People weren't having to necessarily verify their income. Basically, people were just buying houses because the real estate market everywhere was so hot that they were just going to buy it on, making $30,000 a year. They get an adjustable rate mortgage at a super, super low rate. And then before their mortgage adjusts in 3 years, they turn around, they sell it, and then they make a killing off of it, right? So that's really what drove the Great Recession in 2007, 2008. And so when they talk about 170,000 businesses that closed, they don't really go into detail as far as what that means. Because as you remember earlier in the show, we talked about the amount of businesses that actually closed in their first year, which is approximately 20%, just related to standard business cycle, right? People that don't know how to really operate their business. Maybe they got over leveraged way too fast. Maybe they're not good at marketing. Maybe they're not good at sales. Maybe their product sucks. Whatever it might be, approximately 20% of those businesses close. Now, if that's a number, 170,000, that's directly related to the economy and the Great Recession, it's still a big number. It's still a big number. That's a number that exists outside of the potential business cycle, but it doesn't necessarily go into detail. But either way, you're talking about business closures over the span of 2008, 2010 that amounts to about 170,000 to what we're talking about now, which is approximately 4 million. 4 million businesses may potentially close. Small businesses may potentially close due to lockdowns and COVID impacts and so on and so forth. And so the point to really tie it together and back to Hannah's original article is that when we talked about the CARES Act and we talked about all of this big government interference, that has really helped propel major corporations to really take over a lot of small business America and what that impact is. As we just talked about, the Fed has printed up approximately $6 trillion. Their balance sheet, I think at this point is around the $8 trillion mark. If you took $6 trillion and if their concern was really getting money out to the people, right? If they really cared about the people and they cared about the ordinary citizens, each person in this US, all 330-ish million of us, would have essentially gotten a check for about $20,000 a person. So when we look back and we think, oh man, we got that $1,200 check back. Well, we didn't, because the IRS kind of screwed us. I know, big surprise, but we didn't even get that. But if they send out $1,200 to every single person, but they really owed everybody $20,000, where the hell did the rest of that money go? And that's what Hannah really drives home here in this article is that the government doesn't care about the little people. If they did, they would have just wrote everybody a check for 20 grand. What they do care about is they do care about the people who pay for their campaigns, right? One of the things I brought up on social media the other day is that I believe the 2020 election cycle broke all-time records in terms of total funds spent. And then Q1 of this year, lobbying companies spent approximately $1 billion, the most lobbying ever in a single quarter on Washington, D.C. And if you think about it, if you're a big company and you and all your buddies got together and you guys only spent $1 billion on lobbying and you got $2 trillion in a return, that is the type of ROI that us in finance would look at that and go, whatever you're doing, keep doing that, because that is the greatest return on investment that you will ever get, is $1 billion and turning that into $2 trillion. And so it's time that we stop looking at the government as the ability to be able to help small businesses, right? Because they don't care necessarily about a lot of small businesses. What they care about is getting reelected. And I'm sorry, Joe's Plumbing, but you're not helping our representatives get elected. Unless you're cutting checks, it's just not happening. And so what we can do as business owners is not rely on having to require that government stimulus. What we can do, though, is make sure that we understand that it's up to us, right? It's on us to make sure that we, as business owners and as concerned citizens, are as successful as we possibly can be. And so when things like this happen, we aren't reliant with our hands out, hoping that maybe we'll get some table scraps, from the federal government after your Boeings and your airline industries and your massive corporations end up getting able to pick, through everything, and then they throw, some scraps off to us. So kudos to Hannah for doing a great report here. Again, I'm super fired up because I hate seeing stuff like this, and a lot of people out there are like, we need more stimulus and we need more of this. What we need is we need to be able to operate our businesses to take care of us and to take care of our families. We don't need to be forced to stay home and hope that we can get some crumbs enough to keep the lights on. And so again, great job, Hannah. Thank you for listening today. I know I went off on a little bit of a tangent there, but like I said, I'm pretty fired up, because stuff like this does tend to get me kind of angry. But if you like the show and you got something out of it and you learned something, share it with a friend. Hit that subscribe button on YouTube. Subscribers are looking pretty good. We're up quite a bit since we started putting the show on. But subscribe to the show, like the show, share it with a friend. Follow us on social media. Hop over to the website, financeessentials.io. Sign up for the cheat sheet. It also puts you on the newsletter. I try to get kind of a newsletter out weekly that has the links to the podcast, and then also any potential updates and things that we're working on at the time. And if you have any additional feedback, let me know. I'm always open to anything that you guys have to say. And if you guys have any ideas for shows, let me know about that too. But you guys enjoy the rest of your day. I love talking with you. I hope you learned something, and take care. All right.